If you ever hear a heartbeat where there shouldn't be one, don't ignore it. The music above was bright, sharp, and impossibly alive. Violins rising in clean, practiced harmony beneath vaulted ceilings carved from pale stone. Chandeliers blazing like captured stars as silk and silver moved in slow circles across the ceremony hall. But beneath it all, far below polished marble and measured footsteps, there was another sound, softer, buried, wrong, a dull thump, then another. Then silence stretched too long before it came again, weaker this time, like something fighting to be remembered. Elena Whitmore lay curled in a space no larger than a narrow closet, the air thin and cool against her skin, the scent of earth pressing close as if the ground itself had decided she belonged to it now. Her fingers trembling not from fear, but from the slow, creeping cold that settled into her bones, her dress torn at the hem where rough hands had dragged her. Though now there was no one here, no voices, no laughter. Only the distant echo of celebration filtering through layers of stone above. Her head, distorted and hollow, like a memory she no longer had the strength to reach. They had told her to stay quiet. They had told her this was necessary. A defective Omega had no place beneath the gaze of an Alpha King, no place in a hall meant for power and perfection, no place in a night that would decide the future of their pack. So they had taken her below, beneath the ceremony hall, beneath the place where names would be chosen and alliances sealed, and they had closed the hidden door with careful hands, smoothing everything over until it looked untouched, until no one would think to look down. Elena did not scream. She had learned long ago that sound did not change outcomes, that pleading only gave others something to turn away from. Instead, she pressed her palm against her chest, feeling the rhythm there, steady but slower than before, each beat a quiet insistence that she was still here, still breathing, still something more than what they had decided she was. Above her, footsteps shifted, a heavier presence entering the hall, and though she could not see it, she felt the change. Like a pressure in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks across open land. Conversations faltered. Music hesitated, then resumed, thinner now, as if the room itself had drawn a breath it did not intend to release. Somewhere far beyond her reach, a man stepped into the light, and the entire world bent subtly around him. Sebastian Hale did not speak at first. He did not need to. Power had a way of announcing itself without permission, and his presence settled into the hall like gravity, unchallenged, absolute. Yet as he stood there, something in him shifted, something small and sharp that did not belong to ceremony or expectation. A flicker of awareness threading through instinct, pulling at him in a direction that made no sense. His gaze moved, not toward the gathered candidates, not toward the nobles waiting to be acknowledged, but downward, toward the stone beneath his feet. It was faint, so faint most would have dismissed it entirely, but his heartbeat stuttered once, then again, a disruption he could not explain, as if another rhythm had brushed against his own and refused to let go. Beneath layers of marble and silence, Elena's fingers curled tighter against the ground, her breath shallow now, her vision dimming at the edges, yet still she did not close her eyes. Somewhere above, something had changed. She could feel it, not as hope, not yet, but as a shift in the unseen currents that governed everything she had never been allowed to touch. And for the first time since the darkness closed in, the world did not feel entirely finished with her. The moment stretched too long for comfort, the kind of silence that did not belong in a room filled with power, and Sebastian Hale felt it settle beneath his skin like a splinter he could not ignore, his jaw tightening as his gaze remained fixed on the marble beneath his boots, while the air around him thickened with expectation, every noble in the hall waiting for him to move, to speak, to choose. Yet he did neither, because something was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with instinct, something older than rules and sharper than reason pulling at him with quiet insistence. A woman stepped forward, her gown shimmering in the candlelight, her posture flawless, her smile carefully practiced as she lowered her gaze in deference, and the murmurs of approval rippled outward, soft but eager, because she was exactly what they expected, exactly what this night was meant to present. But Sebastian did not see her, not truly, because beneath the surface of everything polished and perfect, there it was again. Faint but undeniable, a rhythm that did not belong, a second, heartbeat brushing against his awareness like a whisper he could not quite catch. His own pulse faltered, once, then steadied, then faltered again, and that was enough to make him shift his weight, subtle but noticeable to those closest to him. The smallest fracture in a presence that was known for absolute control. "Your Majesty," someone said carefully, the title offered like a question rather than a statement, and still he did not respond, because the sound came again, not through his ears but through something deeper, something that recognized life even when it was hidden, something that refused to be dismissed. Beneath the stone, Elena Whitmore drew in a shallow breath that did not quite fill her lungs, her chest tightening as the space around her seemed to press closer. The air thinner now, each inhale measured and fragile, as if the world itself was rationing what little remained. Yet even as darkness crept at the edges of her vision, she held on to awareness with quiet stubbornness, her fingers curling into the cool dirt beneath her, as if grounding herself to something real, something that had not turned its back on her. She could still hear them, faint and distant, the echo of voices above, but something else threaded through it now, something heavier, steadier, like the presence of a storm waiting just beyond the horizon, and for reasons she could not explain, her pulse answered it. A slow, uneven rhythm reaching upward through layers of stone and silence. Sebastian's head tilted slightly, a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for the way the entire room seemed to hold its breath with him, his eyes narrowing just enough to betray that something had shifted beyond control, beyond expectation, and when he finally inhaled deeply, it was not the scent of polished wood or expensive perfume that reached him, but something far more subtle, something almost lost beneath everything else, a trace of something warm and human and fading, and it struck him with the clarity of instinct rather than thought. "Stop," he said quietly, and the word carried farther than it should have, cutting cleanly through music and conversation until the entire hall stilled in confusion, every movement halting as if time itself had hesitated. No one understood. No one dared to ask. Because the Alpha King was not a man who paused without reason, and yet here he stood, unmoving, listening to something no one else could hear, feeling something no one else could sense. Beneath him, Elena's breathing grew softer, her strength slipping in quiet increments, but her mind held on to that distant shift above, that change in the unseen current, and though she had no proof, no certainty, something deep within her refused to let go of the idea that she was no longer completely alone. Sebastian took a single step, then another, not toward the waiting line of hopeful faces, not toward the throne that awaited his decision, but toward the center of the hall where the stone felt different beneath his feet, colder somehow, quieter, as if it were hiding something it was never meant to conceal. And when he stopped, his heartbeat no longer matched the rhythm in his chest alone, because now he could feel it clearly. Another pulse beneath the floor, faint but real, calling to him in a way that could not be ignored. No one moved, because no one understood what they were witnessing, and yet no one dared to interrupt it either. As Sebastian Hale stood at the center of the ceremony hall with his gaze locked on the stone beneath him, his breathing steady but deeper now, as if he were listening with more than just his ears, as if something within him had awakened and refused to be silenced. And the weight of his presence shifted in a way that made the air feel heavier, pressing against every person in the room, until even the faint rustle of fabric seemed too loud. "Your Majesty," the council elder tried again, his voice careful, measured, but there was uncertainty beneath it now, a thread of tension that had not been there before, because this was not how the night was meant to unfold. This was not how an Alpha King chose his mate. And yet Sebastian did not even glance in his direction, his focus narrowing instead on the exact point beneath his feet, where the faint, fragile rhythm continued, uneven but persistent, like a signal that refused to fade. He lowered his head slightly, not in submission but in concentration, his brow tightening as his heartbeat aligned with that distant pulse, matching it, measuring it. And in that moment the truth became impossible to deny, because instinct did not lie. Instinct did not imagine things that were not real, and what he felt was life, buried and weakening, but still there. Beneath the floor, Elena Whitmore's fingers trembled as they pressed into the packed earth, her strength slipping further with each passing second, her breaths growing shallower, her chest rising and falling in a fragile rhythm that felt too light to sustain her for much longer. And yet she held on, not because she believed anyone would come, but because something inside her refused to surrender completely. A quiet defiance that had survived every whispered insult and every turned back. A stubborn spark that would not extinguish even now. The sounds above had changed again, shifting from movement to stillness, and though she could not see it, she could feel it in the way the silence pressed down, heavier than before, as if the world itself had paused to listen. Sebastian's hand lifted slowly, his fingers spreading as he hovered just above the marble surface, not touching it yet, as if confirming what he already knew. And when his palm finally lowered, the contact was deliberate, firm, the cold stone meeting warm skin as his eyes closed for the briefest moment, shutting out the room, the people, the expectations, until there was nothing left but the connection beneath him, the echo of a heartbeat that did not belong to him and yet called to him with undeniable force. A murmur rippled through the hall, confusion and unease threading through the gathered crowd as they watched their king kneel, not in ceremony, not in tradition, but in something that did not fit any rule they understood, and that single movement fractured the illusion of control that had defined the night, because an alpha king did not kneel without purpose, and whatever purpose guided him now was not something they had prepared for. "There is someone below," Sebastian said, his voice low but absolute, cutting through the silence with a certainty that left no room for doubt. And though no one answered, the tension in the room shifted again, sharper now, edged with disbelief and something dangerously close to fear. Beneath the stone, Elena's head tilted slightly as if she had heard something through the layers above her, not the words themselves, but the change in tone, the shift in presence. And for the first time since the darkness had closed in, her heartbeat steadied, not stronger, but more certain, as if it had found something to anchor itself to. Sebastian opened his eyes, and there was no hesitation left in them, no uncertainty, only a focused resolve that replaced every expectation that had once defined this night. And as he pressed his hand more firmly against the floor, his voice did not rise, but it carried nonetheless, firm and unyielding as he spoke again. "She is alive." The words did not echo loudly, yet they settled into every corner of the hall with a weight that no one could ignore. And for a moment no one moved because no one knew how to respond to something that should not have been possible, something that should not have existed beneath their feet, carefully hidden and sealed away as if it had never been there at all. And yet the Alpha King had spoken with certainty, not suspicion, not doubt, but truth. A ripple passed through the gathered crowd, subtle at first, a shift in posture, a glance exchanged too quickly, the kind of reaction that came when fear brushed against authority and did not know where to settle. And near the edge of the hall one of the elders took a hesitant step forward, his voice measured but strained as he said, "Your Majesty, there is nothing beneath the ceremony floor." But even as the words left him, they sounded hollow, because the confidence they required was already breaking apart. Sebastian Hale did not look at him, did not acknowledge the statement, because the truth did not need to be argued when it could be felt, and the faint rhythm beneath the stone had not disappeared, it had not weakened into imagination, it remained there, steady enough to demand action, fragile enough that delay was no longer an option. His hand pressed more firmly against the marble, fingers splayed as if grounding himself to that single point, and when he inhaled, it was deeper than before, drawing in the faint trace that had first caught his attention, that nearly invisible thread of warmth that did not belong to the cold, controlled perfection of the hall, and his expression shifted, not in anger, not yet, but in something sharper, something that recognized what had been done without needing to see it. "Move," he said, and this time the command carried more force, quiet but absolute, cutting through hesitation until the nearest guards reacted on instinct, stepping forward before they had time to question why, their movements quick but uncertain as they approached the center of the floor where their king remained kneeling. Beneath the stone, Elena Whitmore felt something change, not above her this time, but within the ground itself, a faint vibration that traveled through the packed earth and into her hands, subtle but unmistakable, like the beginning of something shifting after being still for too long. And though her strength was nearly gone, though each breath felt thinner than the last, A small part of her responded, her fingers tightening just slightly, her awareness sharpening for a fleeting moment as if her body refused to let go now that something beyond her darkness had finally reached back. Above, the first sound broke the silence, not loud, not violent, but clear, the scrape of movement against stone as hands pressed and tested, searching for a seam that was never meant to be found, and murmurs rose again, no longer contained, spreading through the crowd in uneven waves as realization began to take shape, as whispers formed around a possibility none of them wanted to name. Sebastian did not move back, did not rise, his presence anchored to the exact spot where the hidden truth lay beneath him, his focus unwavering as each second passed, his heartbeat no longer his own alone but matched to the faint, struggling rhythm below. And in that connection there was no room for doubt, no space for denial, only a growing certainty that what had been concealed would not remain so any longer. Carefully, he said, his voice lower now, controlled in a way that carried a different kind of weight, not command alone but intent, and the guards adjusted immediately, their movements slowing, deliberate, as if they understood without being told that whatever lay beneath was not something to be treated as an object, but as something fragile, something that required precision rather than force. The marble shifted slightly under their hands, just enough to reveal that it was not as solid as it appeared, that beneath the seamless surface there had always been a hidden line. And the moment that truth revealed itself, the air in the hall changed again, heavier, sharper, filled with the kind of tension that came when secrets began to unravel in front of those who had believed themselves untouchable. Beneath it all, Elena's breath faltered once more, her vision dimming at the edges, but the faint vibration remained, closer now, clearer, and though she could not see what was happening above, though she could not know who had found her or why, her heartbeat answered that presence with the smallest surge of strength, holding on just a little longer, as if some unseen thread had finally been pulled tight enough to keep her from slipping away. The line in the marble gave way with a muted shift, not a crack but a release, as if the floor itself had been holding a secret it could no longer contain, and the guards paused for the briefest second before carefully lifting the concealed panel, their movements controlled and deliberate as instructed, revealing a narrow opening that exhaled a faint, cold breath into the hall. A whisper of air that did not belong among candlelight and polished stone, carrying with it the subtle scent Sebastian had followed from the beginning, fragile and fading but unmistakably real. The crowd drew back without being told, a collective instinct pushing them away from the revealed space as unease sharpened into something heavier, something that settled in the chest and refused to ease. And even those who had spoken with certainty moments before now said nothing, their silence louder than any denial they could offer. Sebastian rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, but he did not step away, his gaze fixed on the opening as if the rest of the world had fallen out of focus, his presence narrowing to that one point where truth had surfaced. And when he moved forward, it was without hesitation, the distance closing in 2 measured steps before he knelt again at the edge, his hand bracing against the stone as he leaned closer, his breath slowing, sharpening, aligning once more with the faint rhythm below. Beneath the opening, Elena Whitmore felt the change immediately, the pressure above her shifting as the barrier that had sealed her away was disturbed, a thin current of fresher air reaching her face, light not yet visible but present in a way her body recognized. And her chest rose slightly deeper this time, the smallest increase, fragile but real, as if her lungs remembered how to draw in more than what they had been given. Her fingers twitched against the ground, weak but responsive, and though her vision remained dim, a faint awareness pushed through the haze, a sense that something had broken through the silence that had surrounded her for too long. "There," Sebastian said quietly, not as a question but as confirmation, his voice low enough that only those nearest could hear, and yet the certainty in it carried outward, anchoring itself in every mind present, because the Alpha King did not speak without knowing. One of the guards leaned closer, careful, his posture shifting as he peered into the narrow space, and his breath caught in a way he could not hide, the reaction instinctive, unfiltered, and that alone was enough to send another ripple through the hall, sharper this time, edged with realization that could no longer be dismissed. "She is down there," the guard said, his voice lower than before, no longer questioning, no longer uncertain, and the words settled into the silence with a weight that changed everything. Sebastian's expression did not soften, but something within it sharpened further, a focus that left no room for delay. And as he extended his arm into the opening, his movements were controlled, precise, guided by something deeper than sight alone, his fingers reaching into the darkness where the faint rhythm called to him, where life persisted against every intention to erase it. Elena felt it before she understood it, the shift in the air, the presence that was no longer distant but close, unmistakably close, and though her strength was nearly gone, her body responded with a faint, instinctive movement, her hand lifting just slightly from the ground, as if reaching towards something she could not see but could feel with absolute certainty. The distance between them narrowed to inches, then less, and when Sebastian's hand finally brushed against hers, the contact was light, almost weightless, but it carried a clarity that cut through everything else, a connection that did not need explanation, did not need words, because in that single moment the faint, struggling rhythm beneath the earth aligned fully with his own, no longer distant, no longer fading, but present, undeniable, and alive. The moment their hands met, everything else seemed to fall away, not in silence but in clarity, as if the world above and the darkness below had finally aligned into a single point of truth, and Sebastian Hale felt it with absolute certainty, not as a thought, but as a force that moved through him, steady and undeniable. The faint, fragile pulse he had followed now no longer distant, but directly beneath his touch, real in a way that left no room for hesitation. His fingers tightened slightly around Elena Whitmore's hand, not enough to cause discomfort, only enough to confirm that she was there, that she was not fading into something unreachable, and for the first time since he had stepped into the hall, his breathing shifted, deeper, controlled, as if anchoring himself to her presence as much as she was now anchored to his. Beneath the opening, Elena felt warmth for the first time since the darkness had closed around her, not from the air or the ground, but from the contact itself, a steady heat that traveled through her fingers and into her chest, easing the tightness there just enough for her next breath to come slightly easier than the last. And though her eyes could not yet see clearly, though her strength was still fragile, something within her recognized the change immediately, responding not with fear but with a quiet, instinctive trust she did not question. "I have you," Sebastian said, his voice low but firm, not raised for the crowd, not meant for anyone else. And yet the words carried weight beyond their softness, settling into the space between them as something solid, something that would not break. The guards moved closer, their hesitation gone now, replaced by focused urgency as they widened the opening with careful precision, shifting the concealed stone further aside to create enough space for movement, their actions guided by the Alpha King's presence and the understanding that what lay beneath was no longer hidden, no longer dismissible. The hall remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of confusion. It was the silence of realization, of a truth unfolding in front of them that could not be undone, and the weight of it pressed into every corner, into every breath held too long. Sebastian leaned further into the opening, his grip steady as he adjusted his hold, guiding Elena's hand upward with controlled strength, not pulling abruptly but supporting, lifting in a way that accounted for her fragility. And as he did, he felt the subtle shift in her response, the slight return of strength in her fingers, the faint but undeniable attempt to meet him halfway. Elena's body moved with effort, each motion slow, measured, but no longer aimless, no longer fading. Because now there was direction, now there was something to move toward, and as the opening widened enough for her to be seen, a soft collective intake of breath passed through the hall, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, as the truth became visible to all. Pale skin against the shadowed space, a figure that should not have been there, a presence that had been deliberately hidden now revealed under the gaze of those who had chosen not to look. Sebastian did not glance back, did not acknowledge the reaction behind him, because his focus remained entirely on her, on the careful, deliberate process of bringing her out of the darkness without causing further strain, his movements precise, unwavering, guided by something deeper than duty alone. Slowly, he said again, though the word was more for himself than for the others, a reminder to maintain control, to ensure that each motion supported rather than overwhelmed. And as Elena's shoulders cleared the edge of the opening, the contrast between shadow and light became clear, her form emerging into the glow of the hall, fragile but present, no longer hidden beneath stone and silence. The moment held, suspended between what had been and what was now undeniable, and in that space, as Sebastian steadied her against him, one truth settled into place with quiet finality. She had not been forgotten, not anymore. For a single suspended second, no one breathed, because what stood before them did not belong to expectation, did not belong to the carefully constructed order of the night, and yet it was undeniable. Elena Whitmore, an Omega who had been hidden away as if she did not exist, now held within the arms of the Alpha King himself, her presence breaking through every assumption that had defined the ceremony. The light from the chandeliers fell across her face in uneven patterns, revealing the faint traces of exhaustion in her features, the quiet strain in the way her eyes struggled to fully open, but also something else, something steady beneath it all, a resilience that had not been extinguished despite everything that had been done to silence her. Sebastian Hale did not release her, did not step back as custom might have dictated, because nothing about this moment followed custom anymore, and the way his hand remained at her back, firm and supportive, made it clear to anyone watching that she was not to be dismissed, not to be overlooked again. The crowd shifted, not forward but back, a subtle retreat that carried more meaning than any spoken word, because power had changed direction in an instant, and those who had believed themselves secure in their positions now felt the ground beneath them shift in ways they could not control. A voice broke the silence, hesitant at first, then firmer as it tried to regain authority. "Your Majesty, this is highly irregular." But the words faltered before they could fully take shape, because even the speaker seemed to understand that nothing about what had just occurred could be undone by labeling it as such. Sebastian's gaze lifted slowly from Elena to the room beyond, his expression no longer focused solely on the task of bringing her out of the darkness, but now sharpened by something deeper, something that carried weight beyond instinct alone. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, yet edged with a clarity that cut through every lingering doubt. "Irregular," he repeated, not as a question but as a recognition of the word itself, and then his gaze moved across the gathered faces, measuring, assessing, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the avoidance of eye contact, the tension that had replaced confidence. "What is irregular," he continued, "is that she was placed beneath this floor at all." The statement settled heavily, leaving no space for denial, no room for interpretation, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was heavy with the weight of accountability that no one had prepared to face. Elena felt the shift in him before she fully processed his words, the steadiness in his hold, the controlled strength that did not waver even as the atmosphere around them changed. And though her body remained weak, her awareness sharpened enough to register the difference. The way the world that had once turned its back on her was now being forced to look directly at her existence. Her hand, still lightly held in his, tightened just slightly, the smallest movement, but enough to confirm that she was present, that she was no longer slipping away, and that single response did not go unnoticed. Sebastian's attention returned to her for a brief moment, his expression softening only in the slightest degree, not enough for the crowd to fully register, but enough for her to feel the shift, to understand that she was not alone in this moment, not anymore. "Bring water," he said quietly, not raising his voice. Yet the command carried instantly, the nearest attendant moving without hesitation, because the focus had shifted completely, from ceremony to something far more immediate, far more real. The hall remained silent as the movement resumed, not in celebration, not in expectation, but in careful observation, because what had begun as a night of choosing had become something else entirely, something that none of them could predict. And as Sebastian remained where he stood, Elena supported securely against him. One truth became impossible to ignore. The girl they had tried to hide had just changed the course of everything. The glass of water arrived quickly, carried with careful hands that did not dare tremble, and yet the tension in the room made even the smallest movement feel amplified. Every step measured as if the floor itself might shift again beneath them. And when the cup was offered, Sebastian Hale did not take his eyes off Elena Whitmore as he accepted it, his focus steady, unwavering, as though nothing else in the hall held any relevance. "Easy," he said quietly, the word meant only for her, his voice lowering in a way that softened its edge without losing its authority. And as he guided the cup closer, his other hand remained firm at her back, ensuring she did not falter as she leaned slightly forward. Elena's fingers moved again, faint but responsive, brushing lightly against his wrist as she steadied herself, and though the motion was small, it carried weight, a clear sign that her awareness was returning piece by piece, drawn back not by force but by the presence that had reached her when everything else had faded. The first sip was careful, slow, the water cool against her lips, and for a moment her breath caught, not from discomfort but from the sudden contrast, the shift from dryness to something real, something grounding, and as she swallowed, the tension in her chest eased just enough for her next inhale to deepen, fragile but more stable than before. Around them, the silence held, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with observation, with calculation, with the quiet unraveling of certainty among those who had believed themselves untouchable only moments ago. Eyes shifted, some lowering, some darting toward one another in brief, silent exchanges, but no one stepped forward, no one spoke, because the presence at the center of the hall had redefined the boundaries of what was acceptable, and none of them were willing to challenge it now. Sebastian lowered the cup once Elena had taken enough, not withdrawing completely, but keeping it within reach, his attention returning fully to her as he studied the subtle changes in her expression, the way her breathing had steadied, the faint clarity beginning to return to her gaze as her eyes opened a fraction more, adjusting to the light that must have felt overwhelming after the darkness. "Stay with me," he said, the words quiet but deliberate, not a command in the traditional sense, but something closer to a promise, something that carried intention rather than expectation. And though Elena did not respond with words, her gaze shifted slightly, focusing just enough to find him, to recognize the presence that had anchored her when everything else had been slipping away. The contact between them remained unbroken, his hands still supporting her, hers still lightly resting against him. And in that connection there was a steadiness that extended beyond the immediate moment, something that did not need to be explained to be understood. A movement at the edge of the hall drew brief attention, a figure stepping forward with visible hesitation, the fabric of her gown catching the light as she approached just enough to be seen, her expression carefully composed but unable to fully mask the tension beneath it. And though she did not speak immediately, her presence alone carried implication, a connection to what had been done, to the decision that had placed Elena beneath the floor in the first place. Sebastian's gaze lifted briefly, not shifting fully away from Elena but acknowledging the movement with a glance that was sharp enough to halt any further. "Advance." And the unspoken message was clear, not now, not like this, not while the truth still settled into place. The woman stopped where she stood, her posture tightening, her confidence no longer as certain as it had been before, and the distance between them remained unclosed, a space filled with everything that had yet to be addressed. Elena felt the shift again, not in the ground this time, but in the air, the tension that surrounded the moment now taking shape into something more defined, something that suggested this was not the end of what had begun, but only the beginning of something far larger. And though her strength was still returning in slow, careful increments, her awareness sharpened enough to understand that whatever had been hidden was no longer safe from being seen. The space between them held steady, fragile but unbroken, as Elena Whitmore's gaze slowly lifted, her eyes adjusting to the brightness above, blinking against the unfamiliar light that spilled across her vision, and for a moment everything felt distant, blurred at the edges, until one point sharpened into focus, the figure in front of her, the one who had reached through the darkness and found her when no one else had even looked. Sebastian Hale did not move away, did not lessen his hold as her awareness returned, and when her eyes finally met his fully, something shifted again, not in the room, not in the crowd, but in the quiet space between them, a recognition that did not need words, that did not need explanation, because it was felt in the way his heartbeat aligned with hers, steady and certain, as if it had always been meant to. The faint tremor in her breathing eased further, her chest rising more evenly now, and though her strength had not fully returned, the difference was clear, visible in the way her shoulders no longer sagged as heavily, in the way her hand remained lifted instead of falling away, her fingers still resting lightly against his, as if holding on to something she could not yet name but refused to lose. Around them, the silence deepened into something more structured, no longer uncertain but watchful, the gathered crowd no longer reacting but observing, calculating, as the implications of what had just occurred began to settle into place, reshaping everything they had expected this night to be. The woman who had stepped forward earlier remained where she stood, her composure still intact but no longer effortless, her gaze fixed on Elena with something sharper beneath the surface, something that had not been there before, and though she said nothing, the tension in her posture spoke clearly enough, a silent acknowledgement that the situation had shifted beyond her control. Sebastian's attention did not linger on her, not yet, his focus returning fully to Elena as he adjusted his stance slightly, ensuring she remained steady, supported without being confined, his movements precise in a way that suggested both strength and restraint, a balance that did not falter even under the weight of the room's attention. "Can you stand?" he asked quietly, the question simple, direct, and though it carried authority, it was tempered by something else, something that allowed for choice rather than demand. Elena drew in a slow breath before responding, not with words but with action, her weight shifting carefully as she tested her balance, her legs unsteady at first but responsive, and as she leaned slightly forward, his hand adjusted instantly, providing support without hesitation, ensuring she did not falter as she found her footing. The movement was small, controlled, but it carried significance, a clear step forward from where she had been moments before, and it did not go unnoticed. A faint murmur moved through the edges of the hall, softer than before, less chaotic, but filled with something new, something that bordered on disbelief, because what they were witnessing was not simply recovery, it was transformation, the emergence of something that had been deliberately concealed, now standing in full view. Elena's gaze moved again, this time beyond Sebastian, taking in the vast space around her, the height of the ceilings, the rows of figures watching, the distance between where she had been hidden and where she now stood, and though her expression remained composed, there was a quiet shift in her eyes, a growing awareness of the weight of the moment, of the fact that she was no longer unseen. Sebastian followed the movement of her gaze briefly, then returned his attention to her, his expression steady, unwavering, and when he spoke again, his voice was low enough that only she could hear, yet firm enough to carry certainty. "You are not beneath them," he said, the words simple, but the meaning behind them clear, unmistakable, and in that moment, as Elena Whitmore stood within the light of the ceremony hall, supported but no longer hidden, the balance of power did not just shift, it began to redefine itself entirely. The words settled into Elena Whitmore's chest like something solid, something that did not fade the moment it was spoken, and for a brief second she simply stood there, breathing, feeling the weight of the air around her not as pressure anymore, but as presence, as if the space that had once rejected her was now forced to acknowledge her existence. Her shoulders straightened slightly, not out of defiance but out of instinct, a quiet adjustment that came from somewhere deeper than thought. And though her body still carried the lingering weakness from what she had endured, there was a steadiness beginning to form beneath it, something that had not been there before. Sebastian Hale watched the shift closely, his gaze sharp but not harsh, measuring not her strength alone, but her resolve, the way she held herself despite everything that had been done to diminish her. And in that observation there was recognition, not of status or expectation, but of something far more intrinsic, something that aligned with the instinct that had drawn him to her in the first place. The hall remained silent, but it was no longer passive, it was charged, filled with the unspoken understanding that whatever had been planned for this night had been disrupted beyond repair, and that the outcome now rested in a place no one had anticipated. The woman who had lingered at the edge of the scene stepped forward again, this time more carefully, her movements controlled, deliberate, as if each step had been calculated to restore some measure of authority, and when she spoke, her voice was composed, though the strain beneath it could not be entirely concealed. "Your Majesty, there must be some misunderstanding," she said, her tone measured, diplomatic. but the words themselves carried an undercurrent of urgency, as if she were attempting to reshape the narrative before it fully solidified. Sebastian did not turn immediately, his attention remaining on Elena for a moment longer before he shifted his gaze toward the speaker, and when he did, the change was immediate. The warmth that had been present in his focus replaced by something colder, something precise, and far less forgiving. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his voice even, but the subtle emphasis on the words stripped them of any comfort they might have held, and as his gaze settled on her, it became clear that he was not asking for clarification, he was challenging the premise itself. The woman held his gaze, but only for a second longer than was comfortable, her composure tightening as the weight of his attention bore down on her. And though she did not step back, the shift in her posture was enough to reveal that her confidence was no longer absolute. She was not meant to be part of the ceremony, she continued, choosing her words with care. Her presence would have caused disruption. The statement hung in the air, and for a moment, no one reacted, because the explanation, though structured, did not align with what they had just witnessed, did not justify what had been uncovered, and the silence that followed was not agreement, but tension waiting for resolution. Sebastian's expression did not change, but something in his stance shifted, subtle yet unmistakable, as he stepped slightly closer to Elena, not to shield her, but to make it clear where he stood, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a clarity that left no room for interpretation. "And so you chose to remove her entirely," he said, the words not raised, not sharpened, but weighted with the truth they carried, and the implication behind them settled heavily across the room. The woman did not answer immediately, and in that hesitation, the silence deepened, pressing in from all sides, because the absence of denial spoke louder than any defense she might have offered. Elena felt the shift in the exchange, the tension that had moved beyond her and into the space around them. And though her body still felt fragile, her awareness sharpened further, her gaze moving between them as she began to understand the magnitude of what had been set in motion. Sebastian's hand remained steady at her side, grounding, unyielding, and in that presence there was no uncertainty, no hesitation, only a quiet, unwavering certainty that whatever came next would not return to what it had been before. The silence that followed did not break, it deepened, settling into something heavier than before, something that pressed against every person in the hall with a quiet, inescapable weight, and in that stillness, the truth no longer needed to be spoken aloud to be understood, because it had already taken form in the space between them, undeniable and impossible to dismiss. Sebastian Hale did not move away, his presence anchored beside Elena Whitmore with a steadiness that made it clear his position would not shift, and when his gaze remained fixed on the woman before him, there was no anger in it, not the kind that flared and faded, but something colder, something far more controlled, a clarity that left no room for excuses to take root. The woman drew in a slow breath, her composure still intact on the surface, but the subtle tightening of her shoulders betrayed the pressure building beneath it, the realization that the explanation she had offered was no longer sufficient, that the situation had moved beyond careful wording and into something that demanded accountability. "It was for the stability of the pack," she said, her voice quieter now, less certain, as if she were testing the strength of her own reasoning even as she spoke it. "An omega who cannot fulfill expectations would only create imbalance." The statement lingered, but it did not settle, it did not find agreement in the room, and the silence that followed it was not acceptance, it was rejection, quiet but unmistakable. Elena felt the words as they passed through the air, not as an accusation, not as something new, but as something she had heard before in different forms, repeated enough times that they had once begun to feel like truth. But now, standing where she stood, supported, seen, the weight of them shifted, losing the certainty they had once carried. Her fingers tightened slightly at her side, not in fear, but in recognition of the change, the realization that those words no longer held the same power over her as they once had. Sebastian's expression did not alter, but his gaze sharpened further, narrowing just enough to reveal that the explanation had not only failed, it had confirmed what needed no further proof, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet finality that settled into the hall like a closing door. "You speak of imbalance," he said, his tone even, measured. Yet you chose concealment over truth. The words were simple, but they carried weight, cutting through the fragile structure of justification that had been presented, leaving nothing behind to support it. The woman did not respond immediately, and in that pause, the silence shifted again, no longer uncertain, no longer tense, but defined, as if the outcome of this exchange had already been decided in a way that could not be undone. Around them, the crowd remained still, but the energy had changed, no longer aligned with the expectations of the ceremony, but drawn toward the unfolding reality, the recognition that what had been hidden was now at the center of everything, and that the authority guiding the moment had made its stance clear. Elena's gaze lifted slightly, her focus moving from the woman back to Sebastian, and for a brief second, the noise of the room faded, leaving only the quiet space between them, the steady presence at her side, the grounding force that had not wavered since he had reached for her. And in that moment, something settled within her, not certainty, not yet, but the beginning of it, the first fragile shape of something that had not existed before. Sebastian did not look away from her when she turned back, his expression shifting just slightly, the sharp edge of confrontation easing into something more controlled, more focused, and though the hall remained filled with watchers, with unspoken questions and shifting alliances, his attention returned to her, as if that was where it had always been meant to rest. "This ends here," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that left no room for doubt, and the words carried through the room with quiet authority, settling into place as something final, something that would not be challenged, because in that moment, as Elena Whitmore stood no longer hidden but fully seen, the line between what had been allowed and what would be accepted had been drawn, and it would not be crossed again. The finality of his words did not echo, it settled, anchoring itself into the foundation of the hall in a way that felt immovable, and for the first time since the ceremony had begun, there was no expectation left to fulfill, no performance waiting to resume, only the quiet, undeniable presence of truth standing at the center of everything. Sebastian Hale remained where he was, his posture steady, his presence unwavering, and as the weight of his declaration spread through the room, the structure of authority that had once seemed unshakable began to realign, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet precision of something fundamental shifting into place. The woman who had spoken before did not move again, her silence now complete, not chosen but required, because there was nothing left for her to say that could change what had already been established, and the space she occupied felt smaller somehow, diminished not by force but by the clarity that had replaced her influence. Around the hall, figures who had once stood with confidence now held themselves differently, their attention no longer directed toward ambition or opportunity, but toward understanding, toward recalculating where they stood within the new balance that had formed in an instant. Elena Whitmore stood within that shifting space, her breath now steady, her body no longer weighed down by the same fragility that had defined her moments before, and though the remnants of exhaustion still lingered, they no longer defined her, no longer shaped the way she carried herself. Her gaze lifted again, moving across the room with quiet awareness, taking in the faces that now looked back at her not with dismissal, but with something far more complex, something that had yet to settle into a single form. She did not speak, did not need to, because her presence alone now held weight, a silent statement that could not be ignored. Sebastian's attention returned to her fully, and when he moved, it was not abrupt, not commanding, but deliberate, as he stepped forward with her, guiding her gently but without hesitation, positioning her not at the edge of the hall, not in the shadows where she had been forced before, but at its center, where every eye could see her clearly, where there was no longer any space to hide her existence. The shift was subtle in motion, but profound in meaning, and it did not go unnoticed. A quiet murmur passed through the edges of the room, not disruptive, not chaotic, but filled with recognition, the understanding that what had been hidden had now been placed in full view by the very authority that defined the room itself. Elena felt the movement as it happened, the change in position, the way the space around her opened rather than closed in, and though her instinct might once have urged her to step back, to retreat into something smaller, that instinct did not take hold now, because the presence beside her did not allow for it, did not reinforce it, but instead anchored her where she stood. Her shoulders remained straight, her posture steady, and though she did not fully understand everything that had shifted, she understood enough to remain, to not step away from the place she had been brought to. Sebastian's gaze moved once more across the hall, but this time it was different, no longer searching, no longer assessing, but establishing, setting something into place that would not be undone. And when he spoke again, his voice carried clearly, not raised, but firm enough to reach every corner of the room. "She stands here," he said, each word measured, deliberate, as she should have from the beginning. The statement was simple, but it carried weight far beyond its length, redefining not only the moment, but everything that had led to it. And as it settled into the room, no one spoke against it. No one challenged it, because the truth it held had already been proven in a way that could not be denied. Elena's gaze shifted to him once more, and for a brief moment, the vastness of the hall faded, leaving only the quiet certainty in his expression, the unwavering steadiness that had brought her from darkness into light. And in that moment, something within her aligned fully, not just her breath, not just her awareness, but something deeper, something that recognized this turning point for what it was, not an end, but a beginning that would not allow her to return to what she had been before. The hall did not return to what it had been, because something essential had shifted, something that could not be undone by silence or ignored by tradition. And as Elena Whitmore stood at the center of it all, the weight of every gaze upon her no longer pressed her down. It lifted her into something she had never been allowed to become before, something visible, undeniable, and real. The chandeliers above cast steady light across her features, no longer revealing weakness alone, but tracing the quiet strength that had endured beneath it, the resilience that had not broken even when she had been hidden away. And in that light, there was no longer any space left for her to disappear. Sebastian Hale remained beside her, his presence not overwhelming but constant, a steady force that did not demand attention yet commanded it all the same. And as the silence held, he did not rush to fill it, did not force the moment forward, because what had been established did not require further explanation. It simply existed, firm and unyielding. Elena drew in a slow breath, deeper than any she had taken since before the darkness, her lungs expanding fully, the air no longer scarce, no longer fragile. And with that breath came clarity, a quiet understanding that the world she had known had already begun to change, not around her, but because of her presence within it. Her gaze moved once more across the hall, and this time, the faces that met hers did not look away, not entirely, some still uncertain, some still guarded, but none dismissive, none blind to her existence anymore, and that alone marked a difference greater than anything she could have imagined. A soft shift of movement broke the stillness at the edges, not in opposition, but in acknowledgement, as one by one, the figures gathered within the hall adjusted their stance, subtle yet unmistakable, the smallest inclinations of respect forming where there had been none before, not commanded, not demanded, but drawn by the undeniable shift in power that had taken place. Sebastian's gaze moved briefly across the room, observing the change, the recalibration of presence and posture, and though he said nothing, the faintest nod of recognition passed through his expression, not approval, but acknowledgement that the balance had begun to correct itself. He then turned his attention fully back to Elena, and in that moment, the vastness of the hall seemed to narrow again,